Hi, I'm Dr. Abraham Weizfeld, and you're listening to Catholic versus Jew.
If you could just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe it.
Okay. I was born to two Jewish parents from Poland who were refugees. I'm a second-generation Holocaust survivor, and I was raised in the Yiddish language as an Orthodox Jewish person. And nowadays, I call myself Orthodox Jewish Agnostic. So that's where I am, and that's where I come from.
Were you raised with religion and belief in God, and did you pray as a child before meals and at night?
Oh, I was raised Orthodox. I went to Cheder, Talmud Torah school in the evenings. After the Protestant school in the afternoons, I went to evening school for 2 hours. And we translated the Torah from Hebrew into English, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, day after day, year after year. So I did my bar mitzvah, in both the Hebrew and the Aramaic as well. I sang my Haftorah.
Did you believe in God at an early age?
Oh, yes, of course. Even though we never spoke about God anymore, because it was not an appropriate subject, for Holocaust survivors to be discussing, because one could not sort of accommodate God within the context of our living experience. And so, to avoid the question of the responsibility of God or the non-responsibility of God, the Holocaust, we avoided talking about God. And this is, Orthodox Jewish, tradition in any case. You don't talk about God because, you don't take God's name in vain. You don't talk about Hashem, as he's called, for no good reason.
Now, how old are you today, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I'm 69 years old now.
If you compare your faith in God from when you were very young until today, did it go up and down, or was it constantly the same?
Well, we were very constrained, very sort of rigid, conception of religion. So it was said, that if one changed from being a believer to a non-believer, then one would die. God would take a retribution on you. So when I met in high school a friend of mine who became a neurosurgeon, and he was an atheist, and he was Jewish, and he pointed out that he was still alive. That's the first time I met an atheist, and so I had to sort of, change in my conception to some degree. And I did. And then at the age of 14, under the influence of the Einsteinian Revolution, which is actually an endeavor to explain what God is, in 1905, when he came up with his theory, this revolution caused a revolution in my own thinking as well, and I became more interested in physics and studying physics than I was in maintaining a religious, perspective. So I became non-religious at that point. And I went on to study physics at the university, but then I changed to politics and did my PhD in political science at UCOM because of the necessity, of dealing with, social issues and existence.
So what do you think happens to you when you die? What's the best case scenario and what's the worst case scenario?
Wow, there's a big difference, between Orthodox Judaism and Christianity, because in the way I was taught, there was no paradise. There was no hell. When you died, you died. And that you have to follow the law. And then in Yom Kippur, after New Year's in September, you were supposed to regret all the laws that you had not kept, and all the sins that you had committed, and you were supposed to take cognizance of them, and you were supposed to pray for forgiveness, basically, and then you would be inscribed in the book of life for the coming year. And that was it. No paradise. Just the book of life at Yom Kippur.
Okay, so there's an annihilation of your soul at death?
Oh, yeah, there is a concept of a soul, but the soul does not continue to exist, because the soul is considered to be a form of consciousness, I think. And then Freud elaborated this into, the various levels of the soul, which are described, in the Torah as well, in which he developed a whole theory of consciousness and subconsciousness, id, alter ego, and the subconscious, which became, the more scientific expressions of what are to be found in terms of what is called the soul in Judaism.
So is it safe to say that today, right now, you believe that if you were to die, you would just be gone?
Yes, there's no sort of soul which continues to exist as a ghost thereafter.
Okay. And so what motivation do you have to do the right thing, to be good? What is the basis of your morality if there's no consequence whatsoever?
Because of your respect, awe, and obedience to God as a slave. And you have to fear God, not only be a slave, but you have to fear God. Because You see, like at Yom Kippur, if you don't, repent for your sins, and you are not sincere in trying to follow the law of God, then you could be not inscribed in the book of life for the coming year, and you could die in the coming year.
That's what the Orthodox Jews believe, but what do you believe?
Well, for me, morality is a case of ethics. I make a distinction between morality, which is the law of God, and the retribution thereafter, and ethics. Ethics has a logical foundation, but it's very close to morality, because morality also has a logical foundation to it, but it is reinforced, by the will of God. Ethics is reinforced by logic alone. And ethics, an ethical approach to life and other humans and animals and the environment, etc., is a matter of logic. Like if you don't respect life in general, then, eventually all life will die. It's as simple as that.
But that's going to happen anyway, right? The universe will not sustain biological life indefinitely.
Yes, the theory of thermodynamics by Maxwell, the law of entropy.
So what is the basis of ethics, rationally speaking, if nothing we do has any lasting consequences and the universe is destined for the heat death?
Well, life is its own rationale. If we are alive, and we are, then we do with it what we can, and we enjoy it as we can without denying any of those rights, to any other person as well. In my doctoral thesis, I developed a principle of reciprocity, and that is that all the rights that we seek for ourselves can only be accomplished in general and in a lasting manner, and for the maximum number of people, by a principle of reciprocity. That which we wish for ourselves, we must recognize in others as well.
The golden rule.
The golden rule, yeah, which has, in all the religions and philosophies of the world, there's various expressions which repeat the same thing.
But what would prevent someone from calculating a way to maximize his own personal pleasure and profit and luxury at the expense of others with low risk of ever being found out and going to his grave rich, happy, healthy, and fully satisfied in all of his animal lusts and desires? What would prevent him from doing that?
Nothing. We have the example of Trump now in office, Again, do precisely that. This is Machiavellian, logic. And he's a very good Machiavellian, And narcissism, is the principle of individualism that was perpetuated by Protestantism, that the divine will is trying to seek the best for the individual. And so in order to seek success and prosperity in life, one must be religious and, respect God and follow the will of God, and then God will reward you with a prosperous and etc. life. Plus paradise as well,
So how would you convince someone that believes that to come over to a more reciprocal point of view?
Yeah, well, once, that the existence of God was dismissed by Nietzsche and morality fell to the wayside, as a result, either one developed a theory of ethics or one just may do without any morality or any ethics, which is what Nietzscheism, is all about,
In my podcast, I rarely talk about politics because I'm not interested, but I know that you're involved in the political sort of philosophy of the Middle East. So I'm going to make an exception for my podcast and I'm going to allow you to sort of elaborate on that. I find it boring because I don't understand it, but maybe you can break through my thick skull here and just talk in general terms so that the audience could understand what your life's work's been about.
Well, empirically, what I've done is that now I go to live in Palestine with the Palestinians in the city of Nablus. And the people who know me, know that I'm Jewish, but they accept me and they welcome me, So by living there, I am demonstrating that, the different religions and the different cultures and the national identities, as national identities, can live together, without, violence, that it is possible. And in fact, even within, pre-67 Israel, in the cities of Akka, Jaffa, and Haifa, the populations are mixed, half-half, Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian, and they're living together, and it's quiet there. It's the most peaceful part of the country, those cities there. And it's in Jerusalem where the government is trying to divide the population along what's called the separation principle, which one of the early Russian Zionist theoreticians called the separation principle. When that is being implemented, it generates violence. in cultural terms, I want to can explain the political dynamics without getting boring and without getting lost, as saying that, between peoples, it is possible to live together. But when we talk about, the political superstructures, the state structures that are established over peoples, then you get into trouble, because then you have the military, you have the power which corrupts, etc. And, by necessity, people are going to have to change their orientation to how they see themselves living with their cultural identity, and not depend upon, an army to guarantee their security, but rather guarantee their security by mutually guaranteeing the security of those that you live with. When you have a mutual treaty of reciprocity, then you have mutual security as well.
So what have you learned about power, and why does it make people hateful?
Because power allows those who hold the power, who control the power, to reap tremendous advantages. They find that the power enables them to create things that are beneficial for themselves. But we should use the wealth that we have and are generating to do things that, free university education for everybody, because, the robots are taking over and they're going to do all the work for us, So what do we do with our lives? We live and learn, that's what we do with our lives.
Are you a fan of Karl Marx's philosophy, or?
At first, I was enchanted with Marx, yes, and with Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. Lev Bronstein is his Jewish name. But the problem is that both Marx and Trotsky were assimilationists. They were giving up on their own culture and calling themselves either German or Russian in order to hold a position of power. Because, they wanted to have power within the state over a largely Russian Christian population. And so it wasn't, advantageous for Trotsky to proclaim that he's Jewish, because he wouldn't get to keep his position of power. And eventually that was one of the reasons for his downfall, because Stalin was able to utilize Russian nationalism to monopolize power and eventually assassinate Trotsky, who got in his way. So both Marx and Trotsky were mistaken in that respect. And Marx was very overt about, his assimilationism. He wrote a pamphlet in 1848 called On the Jewish Question, which is not even a question as far as I'm concerned, in which he called for assimilation in order for the Jewish people to be liberated. And in fact, he was himself raised in a Lutheran household because his parents, who were Jewish, converted to being Lutheran in order to facilitate his mobility, his upward mobility. And probably it did help him, to get his university PhD. But at the cost of his own culture and his own, religious beliefs, it's that's not justifiable.
What would you say about political correctness? Can you talk a little bit about cultural Marxism and the connection between cultural Marxism and political correctness and how it's going astray today?
Well, political correctness is sort of a populist conception of what revolutionary theory should be about. When one talks about historical progression and talks about the advances to be made in terms of social cohesion and societal construction by means of constituent assembly, etc., the cruder forms of such expressions are to be found in various cliches. Cliches are the big thing, like people sort of learn more so from osmosis than they do from reading books. So they learn, it's correct to say this, but not correct to say that. And then that's what they do. They follow that, but they don't know why. Or maybe if they choose to think about it further, they can, find out a little bit, why that's correct, but they don't really know the deeper meaning, of the terms that they're using. So, like the term race used to be a term that was considered to be a scientific term. And what is called race is actually a misnomer and is actually a name for what are known in sociology as national identities. So culture is fundamental, to humans and has been called race, but it is not a biological race at all. And what we see in terms of, biological differences in terms of color and size of whatever, is actually a certain genetic heritage that we get from various areas of the world. Like I'm half Semitic, because the Ashkenazi Jewish population is composed of all those descendants of Jewish traders and slaves who were brought to Rome, who intermarried with European women who converted to being Jewish. And so, the Ashkenazi Jewish people are called Ashkenazi because in Hebrew, Ashkenazi means German. So we are the German Jews. And that's why we speak Yiddish. And my Yiddish, which is my first language, ich kann noch reden Yiddish auch. My Yiddish is a German dialect, and I can understand German as a result. So,
have you done your DNA testing yet?
No.
Would you be interested to find out what your genetic test told you about your ethnic heritage, or no?
Well, I know pretty well because my parents and all their ancestors, were Orthodox Jewish, which meant that they didn't mix other than with the original sort of Jewish residents in Rome, mixing with European women. We have Semitic background, and the Semitic background, originally comes, with the heritage brought by Abraham from where? From Mesopotamia. And where's that? Iraq, from the city of Ur, in the province of Sumeria. That's why I'm named Abraham, because I was named after my grandfather, who was named after his grandfather, etc., all the way back to the original Abraham. And of course, Abraham, first son, is Ishmael, who became the father of the Arab nations. So all the Arabs are as Semitic as the Jewish people are.
Can I ask you a couple of cultural questions about Judaism in general?
Sure, yeah.
First of all, humor. Why are Jews funny?
Because the Jews are oppressed, and so in order to rebel, humor is a form of rebellion against oppression. So if you can laugh, that means that you are surviving, that you're doing well at that moment, and that you don't care about being oppressed at that moment, that everything's okay, that you are going to be okay, and that you will survive and things will get better.
I have another question for you. What is it about Jews and money? Why do they have the reputation of liking money, being good with money, being smart with money?
Well, it's a matter of survival. You see, because, well, first of all, Jews became very expert in import-export and in banking because Jewish people could communicate on an international basis by using the Hebrew language because they had a common language. Okay, and in Europe, Yiddish was a common language in which Jewish people could communicate, from one country to another. So they were able to make exchanges of one sort or another in terms of either, loans or goods, for import-export in an easy way. And also the people of each of their countries became dependent upon them for the import-export and for the banking services because they themselves were not able to engage in such international commerce. So the Jews were expert in international relations in economic terms. And so this became a basis for the anti-Semitic theory that the Jewish people controlled, the world economy, which is a wild exaggeration, to say the least. If you look at the Forbes top 500 wealthiest people in the world, you'll find about 8 Jewish people. And amongst those, you'll find Zuckerberg and Soros, who are billionaires, yes, but they're not pro-Zionist. So the pro-Zionist lobby is certainly not a dominant affair. It is a lobby, but subject to the much greater forces that are prevalent in the world, like the military-industrial complex of the United States.
Can you talk a little bit about Islam, the religion?
Islam is a very progressive religion. If one wants to talk about a Judeo-Christian tradition, it is to be found in Islam, but it is not to be found in Christianity. Christianity has dissociated itself from Judaism and has recreated the notions of heaven and hell, and also the notions of the demigod, as Hercules in the Greek mythology, in which the Greek word Christ has been used and applied to Yehoshua ben Yaakov, who is called Jesus Christ in Christian theology. So the differences between Judaism and Christianity were exaggerated by the various forms of Christianity, even though Protestantism sought to reunify with Judaism by translating the Torah as a text of Christianity, which was a progressive step. But Islam has adopted all the books of Judaism and Christianity to become a religion which does not follow a national identity alone, which does not follow an exclusive religious identity alone, but rather is an inclusive religion that welcomes others to join in it, and only became militaristic and expansionist with the Berber nations who became converted to Islam in North Africa and expanded to include Spain as well, which then came into conflict, with the countervailing Christian crusades, which reconquered Spain and then went on to seek to conquer the Holy Land as well. But Islam has sought to achieve a historical advance on the previous religious expressions, and I respect Islam for that reason. And it is, generally speaking, a peaceful religion. But when confronted with a crusade, it has provisions for resistance. And what we have had happen since the First World War was the British reconquest of Jerusalem. And when General Allenby walked into Jerusalem, his famous words were, "This is the last crusade." That is exactly what we have, is the conflict, in Jerusalem nowadays between Islam and the Zionist Christian motif. The Balfour Declaration, General Allenby, and then later the occupation of Palestine by the Zionist militias, all are a trilogy of events, which are all related to each other, and is provoked, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which is the Intifada that's continuing now, and which is represented more so by Hamas, which claims the rights of Islam in Jerusalem, which is denied by the Zionist government, with the more extreme right-wing political parties which want exclusive control over the Temple Mount, as it's called, which is now the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So it's a very, interesting and dangerous time that we're living in.
Okay. And what about the level of atheism or agnosticism in Jerusalem?
It's estimated that 20% of the Jewish people are religious. Only 20%. However, in Israel, it's 38%. And in Jerusalem, it's about 50%. Very high dominance of Hasidim, who are not Zionists, who refuse military service. He even refused to vote in Israel's elections. So when you look into it, it's much more complex than it's portrayed to be, by the Zionist spokespersons.
The Christians and Muslims in Jerusalem, are they highly religious?
And in Nablus, like 99% of the population are Muslim, and strictly Muslim. 99% or more of the women, even the young women, wear the hijab, the hair covering. And I mean, they can be, as progressive as anybody else, leftists and everything like that, but they'll still be wearing a hijab because it's a cultural identity, and they maintain Islam as a cultural identity as well. And it's also, Islam provides the Palestinians with a sense of perspective and hope in terms of overcoming the military occupation. So Islam plays this role that politics has not been able to fulfill. Politics has been a disappointment. And the Palestinians are very critical of the Palestinian Authority, which has been supervising the occupation in conjunction with Israel's military. So Islam has replaced politics as a belief system and as a life perspective.
What about ISIS and all those extreme terrorist forms of Islam? Can you just talk in very general terms? Because I don't understand any of that. Just sort of explain it to me. How does that fit in between politics and religion? Where does it lie?
Daesh, or ISIS, or the Islamic Caliphate, or the Islamic State, has its foundation in Islam as well. When one talks about a jihad against occupation or against a crusade, it resembles what is being called jihad by the Daesh movement. Only they are using it in a very sectarian way to oppose anybody who's not a believer in their own belief system. So it becomes an exclusivist, project, much like the Berber Islamist expansionist tendency that took over Spain at one point. But one has to take note that this jihadist extremism, for the most part, took place within the countries that were under occupation, like Afghanistan, which used to be under Russian communist occupation, when the Mujahideen were being supported by the CIA to expel the Russian occupation, then became, the Al-Qaeda formation against the American occupation of Afghanistan thereafter. Then the jihadist, Mujahideen Taliban, which took over from that. but they were always within their own countries. What Daesh did is became an international jihad against the Western military occupations of Oriental countries. So that was a one step up. Now, the Daesh expanded into terrorist operations against civilians within the Western countries. And so taking the offensive against the Western countries, much like the Western countries took the offensive against the Islamic countries by military occupation. So, I mean, for the jihadists of the Daesh kind, it's easy for them to justify what they are doing because they are merely doing what the Western crusaders are doing to a lesser degree. So it's easy for them to justify that, even though they are violating the precepts of Islam, which are pacifist and respect, life, of all sorts. So it's something that need not be, but is at the present time, until there will be no more military occupation of Islamic, cultures and the territories in which they live. So it's a geopolitical question as well.
So this is a sort of a strange question for you, but what's your favorite religion?
So I have an affinity for my Judaism, but I also have much respect for Islam. But Christianity scares the hell out of me because I'm a second-generation Holocaust survivor. It's part of my post-traumatic stress disorder. But if that's what you want to practice, then that's okay with me, then no big deal. I wonder if you are a harbinger of a tendency in the Catholic religious culture that will bring about revolutionary change within that particular religious culture. Now, we see indications of this in two phenomena. One, in the Catholic Latin American tradition of liberation theology, and then secondly, in the current Pope, who has a certain affinity to presenting himself as a progressive figure. So I think that you are perhaps part of a greater tendency which will have an interesting effect and create a change which will overcome many of the faults in that religious culture that were perpetuated previously.
I don't consider myself a progressive, but can you define the term?
Well, progressive would be somebody who would agree to live and let live, and that they wish to live in their own fashion, with their own culture, their own religion, but they don't find it abhorrent that other people will live in other religious tendencies, unlike the new Bill 62, of the Quebec legislature, which doesn't consider it to be acceptable that somebody else will choose to display their differing religious culture.
According to your definition, I'm definitely a progressive. Whenever I see a Hasidic Jew in my land with their characteristic garb, or whenever I see a Muslim woman with a hijab, I love it. I want to see more of that. Frankly, I want more modesty in dress in general for Christian women because I find that they're showing too much skin. I find that it's attractive to look at a woman's breasts when she's exposing them. And I don't want that because I'm already happily married. I don't want to see every woman's breasts, right? Even though they're beautiful, but I don't want that temptation. So I prefer to see a Muslim woman that I know that she is very modest in public anyway. And what comes to mind when I see a Muslim woman is God Almighty. But when I see a Christian woman with her breasts hanging out, I think about sex.
Yes. The Protestant individualism has been translated by Protestant women to be an affirmation of their own sexuality because they know the power of their own sexuality and they want to use this power for their own individual reasons. But at the same time that the Christian Protestant, political culture allows for the women to display themselves, in a prideful manner, at the same time, they reject the attention which it creates in their bodies as well. So, it's hypocritical in a way, and modesty can be a very attractive feature. When I'm speaking with Muslim women and I'm looking at their face and concentrating on their eyes and their mouth when they are speaking, I have a much higher degree of communication with the women. And I'm communicating with the Muslim women as people and not just as a woman. Now, those Muslim women who don't want to communicate, don't want to expose themselves to being looked at, so they wear a veil. Okay. The real reason, for the, suppression of a face veil is because it is a Christian dress code that is being imposed on the population in general. And also in the National Assembly, we have the Christian cross, which is being imposed on the National Assembly as well, which is still hanging there. And even here in Montreal, on top of the mountain, we have a Christian cross, which is being held for all to look up at and considered to be the character of the city. So I object to all of these religious manifestations. So the cross in the National Assembly should be removed.
Okay. So I'd like to end on a positive note. So just to wrap up the interview, what would you say to anyone that's out there listening now?
Well, humans are a social animal, and humans like to be in the company of other humans. And humans love other humans. The basic tendency is for humans to love one another. The reason why there is alienation in society is because of an imposition that is contrary to the natural tendency of human nature. Now, to be happier, one should become conscious of the factors that are being imposed upon one's life that are contrary to one's human nature. Once one becomes conscious of these contrary tendencies and impositions, one can overcome them with one's own consciousness, and therefore overcome the fears that one has, the neuroses that one has, and be able to approach other people in a social manner that will open up a whole avenue of life that one didn't think was possible previously.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you've got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.